Dilemmas of leadership in a thermonuclear world. And what can history, especially the history of how American presidents wrestled with the enormous responsibility of nuclear decision-making, tell us about our contemporary nuclear dilemmas? Let me begin with a story from the past. Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson purportedly advised President Kennedy that his most important responsibility was to think long and hard about nuclear weapons. You must decide whether or not you will use them, and then tell no one. Kennedy appeared to heed this advice. He asked searching questions of his advisors and even authorized a closely held study of how a preemptive nuclear strike on Soviet nuclear forces would unfold and what it would accomplish. And of course, he faced perhaps the most dangerous period in world history when a nuclear exchange seemed frighteningly possible. Beginning with the disastrous Vienna summit and the building of the Berlin Wall in the summer of 1961, and culminating in the terrifying crisis over Soviet missiles in Cuba, no world leader in history ever came closer to a thermonuclear war. What did Kennedy think about nuclear weapons? And did he ever seriously entertain using them? I can argue it either way. The risks he took and the strategy he embraced were quite aggressive. America's nuclear war plans followed a certain logic. Go first, go fast, go hard, so that the Soviets would be left with nothing in reserve if war came. He authorized a speech by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Roswell Kilpatrick, in the fall of 1961, which Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev interpreted with some justification as a first strike speech. The Soviet secret placement of nuclear-tipped warheads was cast as a grave affront, and time was not on America's side. In the fall of 1962, the United States had such an overwhelming strategic nuclear superiority that in a preemptive nuclear attack, there was the possibility that they could actually neutralize the ability of the Soviet Union to respond. This window, which opened up and was recognized only with new orbital satellites, allowing the United States to target vulnerable Russian forces, would close quickly, within a year. Does that mean if the Russians had not pulled their nuclear forces from Cuba, that JFK would have risked nuclear war in an assault on an island? Not necessarily. There's as much evidence, if not more evidence, pulling in the opposite direction. Kennedy would have worked diligently to make sure that nuclear weapons were under firm American and civilian control. He had installed permissive action links and increased civilian control over the bomb. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as Fred and Philip know better than anybody, he sought solutions that avoided the risk of escalation, which he feared any military attack on Cuba would bring. He used his brother, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, to negotiate with Soviet representatives, going around some of his more hawkish advisors. While it is impossible to prove, there's evidence that JFK would have gone to great lengths to avoid any military clash, which could have led to a rapid nuclear escalation. The evidence of the desire to avoid nuclear use becomes even more clear in the aftermath of the crisis, after Khrushchev removes the missiles from Cuba. When the crisis was over, he worked diligently in the year that followed to reduce nuclear dangers. Instead of seeking to exploit the victory in the Cuban Missile Crisis and further grind down the Soviets, he decided instead, at great domestic political cost and to the consternation of his Western allies, to work with the Soviets to reduce nuclear dangers, a process which led to the first major nuclear arms control agreement, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and the beginnings of a period of relative détente that lasted for 2 decades. Why am I telling this history and why does it matter today? I want to briefly highlight several often underappreciated dilemmas that a nuclearized world visits on international politics. This is especially important as we wrestle with the war in Ukraine and the highly irresponsible nuclear threats that Russian President Putin and his associates have made. How seriously should we take these nuclear threats? And what does the past reveal about individual leaders who made or received nuclear threats? Reactions, as we know, have been on a spectrum, to those who have dismissed Putin's nuclear threats as bluffs that should be ignored, to those who argue they must be taken with the utmost seriousness. Who is right? This highlights the first of what I'm going to offer as 6 puzzles and dilemmas about individual leadership in the nuclear age. The truth is that we can't a priori know how best to evaluate nuclear threats. Most of our arguments are about nuclear deterrence, which is about preventing something from happening. And given how much we argue, even at this conference, about things that actually did happen, figuring out why something like nuclear use did not happen is very hard, if not impossible. For example, did America's nuclear weapons prevent the Soviet Union from taking over Western Europe during the Cold War? Or did the Soviets never have any intention of coming across and taking Western Europe and were deterred by other actions? Did nuclear weapons provide for stability in what John Lewis Gaddis has called the long peace? Or, as the Berlin and Cuban Missile Crisis reveal, did they actually bring the world close to a catastrophic thermonuclear war, which is unimaginable in a world without nuclear weapons? A second dilemma. Thermonuclear weapons have transformed the international system, yet the decision to use them typically lies in the hands of a singular individual. Great power wars of conquest and invasion, which shaped world politics for millennia, made little sense in a thermonuclear world after the 1950s. The consequences of nuclear use are overwhelming and catastrophic and would affect millions, if not tens of millions, including many people outside of the battle zone. There are few, if any, political goals worth this cost. Such an enormous capability, one would think, could only be used if the decision went through a serious, complex process where every stakeholder had a say. But in fact, as we know, the decision to use nuclear weapons usually lies in the hand of one leader at the top of the system. Today, a Biden, a Sunak, a Xi, a Macron, a Modi, a Putin. This concern about the extraordinary concentration of power in one's hands was highlighted, understandably, during the Trump administration presidency. Indeed, the concentration in the American case is likely more pointed than in others because of the history of American war plans, which were often preemptive, required incredibly fast decision-making. Regardless of the reason, the idea that one person can make a decision that affects the fate of the planet is, to say the least, deeply concerning, which leads to a third dilemma. While it makes literally no strategic sense to use these weapons, there's enormous incentive to make others think you might use them. In other words, bluffing, which is just a polite way of saying lying, and it can be rewarded. Compare this with a non-nuclear world. Imagine I have 50 tanks and takes on an adversary like Alina, and she has 500 tanks. My threat to attack her is not credible, because if she calls me on it, she'll clean my clock. The same is not true with nuclear weapons, where Alina might be more responsible. She may have 500 nuclear weapons, say, it's not responsible to use them, and signal such. And me, being far less responsible, might actually make threats and make it look like I would use them, and thereby potentially getting my way. Who could tell if I was serious or not? Given the consequences of nuclear use, doesn't it make some sense to pay attention to the threat? Indeed, if you look at the detail of Soviet Premier Khrushchev's threats of nuclear blackmail in the late 50s and early 1960s, as Sergei knows, one can almost imagine circumstances where he got away with it, where the West just simply conceded to his threats. And to be clear, this is not simply an issue for dictators and despots. The United States has long based its grand strategy on a willingness to use nuclear weapons first. It was arguably the threat to use nuclear weapons by Eisenhower and Kennedy that prevented Khrushchev from taking Berlin or keeping missiles in Cuba. And President Richard Nixon, who I think learned this watching Khrushchev, on several occasions tried to put forward strategies and positions that made it appear like he would be willing to use nuclear weapons. The tapes reveal he often considered the madman theory, or the rationality of an irrational approach. Indeed, this highlights the fourth dilemma, that the United States has been willing to go first in order to keep the states that it protects, like Japan, like Germany, like South Korea and other allies, from acquiring their own nuclear weapons. It is often forgotten how radical America's nuclear nonproliferation and extended deterrence policies are. Rare in human history has a state been able to prevent another state from acquiring a technology that meets its most important, difficult goal, protecting its sovereignty and largely eliminating the danger it will be invaded and conquered. Yet American presidents have entered into a number of security arrangements to offer to protect allies from assault by nuclear-armed enemies, to keep them from acquiring and developing their own independent nuclear weapons, and in the process, expose the American homeland to nuclear attack in order to protect some faraway country. The radical nature of extended deterrence is rarely appreciated, though it's at the heart of the debate over Ukraine's accession to NATO. Which leads to the fifth dilemma. Nuclear weapons are tools of the weak. They flatten out other forms of power, being conventional, whether they be conventional military power, economic power, cultural attraction, soft power. Nobody in the West would ever think about North Korea for a minute if they didn't have nuclear weapons. But that they do possess the bomb means that a sixth-rate power with a barely functioning economy commands the attention of the United States and other countries in the region. Which leads to a final dilemma. 1 minute. One that I cannot prove, but I think is true. And that is, if any American president could wave his hand, with the possible exception of Richard Nixon, they would have eliminated nuclear weapons from the world. Why? Imagine the terrible individual responsibility. You alone had the decision to use a weapon that could incinerate countries and kill tens of millions, if not end life on the planet. Your adversaries are often ruthless authoritarian tyrants, and the choice to use the weapons will not come from a direct threat on the American homeland. Canada and Mexico aren't invading you anytime soon, and the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean provide all the protection you need. Your choice to use the bomb and expose your own citizens to destruction will be made to protect a faraway ally when it's attacked. Just as bad, you strongly sense at the end of the day you would never actually do it. Short of a direct nuclear attack upon the American homeland, and even then you weren't sure. Consider Eisenhower and Kennedy, facing an aggressive geopolitical ideological dictator that was committed to aggression and world revolution, willing to do terrible things to its own citizens, all within living memory of another dictator, Adolf Hitler. In a world where they didn't have satellite pictures and surprise attacks like the ones that happened in 1941 were still possible, and the United States possessed arguably meaningful nuclear superiority. Still, neither president came close to using them during a dangerous crisis. It was a giant bluff, a fact that Henry Kissinger acknowledged after he left government. So to conclude, if you're a US president, why would you want a world where these terrible weapons empowered your otherwise weak enemies, which gave you sole responsibility for doing something so horrendous, and was essentially based on a lie, that you would use these weapons to protect faraway allies? Yet needless to say, nuclear weapons exist. They're likely to be part of leading power arsenals for quite some time, and the dilemmas and puzzles around them are unlikely to be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a distinction between tactical nuclear weapons, sort of battlefield weapons, and nuclear weapons as weapons of mass destruction?
So obviously, during the Cold War, most nuclear weapons were strategic nuclear weapons, and they were built to target other strategic nuclear weapons, and they had a destructive pattern that would have led to many, many, many more casualties. I mean, there's this effort to create smaller yield nuclear weapons in this unending but ultimately fruitless attempt to find some way that they can be useful on the battlefield. And so the question you would ask is, can these weapons be small enough that they ultimately would have some use on the battlefield? And it's very, very hard to find any reason why that would happen. The second would be, would the use of them, given the logic of escalation, actually just lead to the larger and larger weapons?
So when Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons, it is mass destruction?
I think from what we know when he's considered using them, and there's the whole issue with nuclear policy is there's such an incentive to bluff even when he knows we're listening to him and it appears like he's threatening to possibly use them. Do you take that seriously and he is possibly using them, or does he know we're listening and he's threatening, trying to get a response? I think that his calculation is to call the bluff that the US would never use nuclear weapons in response to him using nuclear weapons.
Thank you.